Upon its release, Celeste was widely praised for its story, which portrayed the experience of anxiety through its gameplay. The topic of storytelling in games is fairly complex because there are two parallel narratives happening at the same time. There is what I will call the explicit narrative, which is the story told by the game's writing, setting, dialogue, visual design, audio design, or other story elements. The other narrative is the Ludo Narrative, which is the story told through the mechanical systems and how the player interacts with those systems. For example, the Shovel Knight explicit narrative is that Shovel Knight is going on an adventure to rescue Shield Knight. The Ludo Narrative is the story of how I specifically got from point A to point B. Every jump, death, or swipe is a part of my Ludo Narrative. Celeste's Ludo Narrative forces the player to confront and overcome repeated failure. This floundering often evokes feelings of anxiety, as the player wonders if maybe they can't accomplish their task. This got me thinking about other similar games. The gameplay of Celeste and Super Meat Boy differ in a lot of ways, but fundamentally both are hard-as-nails platformers with quick respawns, one-hit deaths, and a focus on momentum. Despite their mechanical similarity, one of these games was praised for how its gameplay facilitated themes of overcoming anxiety through gameplay, and the other wasn't. Why is that? Well, I would argue that a game's Ludo narrative is viewed and contextualized through its explicit narrative. Priming is a psychological concept that describes an instance where someone's response to a stimulus is altered by a previous stimulus. For example, the Stroop test shows participants a bunch of color names that are printed in a mismatching color of ink. It would take participants longer to read those words than a list of other non-color words. The participants saw the colored ink, and that stimulus affected how they perceived the color names, specifically making them harder to read. I would argue that the explicit and Ludo narratives have a similar interaction. The explicit narrative psychologically primes your interpretation of the Ludo narrative. Celeste clued players into its ludological mental health themes with its explicit narrative. I mean, this game has a literal personification of Madeline's fears and anxieties that chase her around, telling her how dangerous mountain climbing is and how she will never be good enough to do it. Celeste put a lot of care and effort into its explicit narrative about anxiety with several well-crafted scenes that discuss the nature of this mental illness. On the other hand, Super Meat Boy doesn't have any scenes about confronting anxiety, instead choosing to focus on a story which is a parody of the played-out Super Mario Bros. Story, where Bowser kidnaps Peach and Mario runs off to save her, while also spoofing other NES classics. There are also a lot of religious themes in there as well, and I think this game is trying to say something about abortion, but honestly, I haven't played enough to fully piece together what it's trying to say about those themes. With that being said, I don't think Super Meat Boy is trying to have a serious discussion about anxiety or other mental issues. Viewed through the lens of the explicit narrative, the ludic narrative of Super Meat Boy is about how this platformer is tough as nails, just like all those other classic games. These narratives both have their merits, and they were both trying to accomplish different things. Super Meat Boy was trying to be a love letter to NES platformers, and Celeste was trying to be a sincere exploration of anxiety. These games show the link between explicit and Ludo narratives, and how two mechanically similar games can produce different Ludo narratives, by changing the way that gameplay is contextualized.